I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1726 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran, along with Dr. Robert M. Rodrigues, that notable history professor from the University of Duquesne up there in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He's going to continue unraveling the chronicles of the Nixon years in Vietnam. In this episode, he's going to be talking about none other than Lam Son 719. That was a big operation over there. It is a pleasure for me to hear him describe it because I was right there on the ground and flying out of Quezon Son, Vietnam from the day it started to the day it ended. It was a big operation, and he is going to tell you all about it. He's also going to cover other such subjects as the departure of General Abrams from the scene in Vietnam, and he's also going to talk about the Pentagon Papers. Everybody's favorite. You either loved them or you hated them. Dr. Bob is going to tell you all about them. Again, I want to remind you, since we have such a distinguished presenter here on the podcast, I am asking that you get rid of all distractions in your vicinity. Turn off all your electronics. Run out all the loudmouth people in your vicinity. Get a pencil and paper nearby so you can take notes, because he's going to be laying a plethora of interesting facts and dates and figures on you in this podcast. So I am advising you to make some notes. Without any further ado, I'm going to hereby turn the microphone over to Dr. Bob. Sir, you've got the microphone. It's all yours. Go for it.
Hi, Mac. Glad to be back. We left off last time with the unfortunate killings at Kent State and Jackson State due to the protests against the escalation of the Vietnam War after many promises that the Vietnam War would wind down. Escalation had occurred in Cambodia and Laos. We're going to start with a very significant battle that occurred. It's called Lam Son 719. And mostly its significance is this is the very first time that under Vietnamization that the fighting is going to be turned over to the ARVN with American air support. All right, we will support them by air, but now they are going to do the work on the ground. This was part of the Vietnamization process. There had been a bill passed in America. It's actually called the Cooper-Church Amendment. This prohibited American ground troops to cross into Cambodia and Laos. Under Operation Cedar Falls, they had crossed over the border into Cambodia. The Cooper-Church Amendment now said that this could not happen, could not be. Lam Son 719 was a bloody affair. Historical forces really varying in casualty counts, but the ARVN First Corps probably suffered around 7,500 casualties, and the Communist forces suffered around 13,000. Now, from the United States point of view, our casualties were pretty much confined to air crews, but they took tremendous emotional significance because they were incomparably high losses during this 2-month operation, the heaviest than any during the Vietnam War, for the air, in this case, helicopters. It began on February the 8th of 1971. Generally, the major offensive operations conducted by the North Vietnamese was between January and June, which was the dry season. July to December was the monsoon and the rainy season. We had pretty much identified this through American casualties. When was most of the casualties occurring? And of course, they were occurring in those first 6 months of the year. On the surface, the ARVN started with 16,000 troops, and they crossed into the Laotian Panhandle, and the whole purpose was to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now, let's back up a little bit. Earlier, last time, I mentioned in Cambodia, there had been an overthrow of Prince Norodom Sihanouk. He was overthrown by Lon Nol, and Lon Nol closed the port of Sihanoukville, which was a opening for the NVA and the VC to bring in troops or supplies or whatever via the water. So Lon Nol, when he closed this, it just kind of set in motion the idea, okay, let's now go to the north and chop off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In the south, Sihanoukville was going to be shut down. So let's go to the north, we'll cut that part off, and this way the supply route will be removed, okay? And then this was in 1971. Keep in mind, the American strategy was to turn the war over to the South Vietnamese, and one of the things they wanted to be able to do is to stop the supply route coming into South Vietnam, and that we, the United States, would offer air support to South Vietnam so they could get on their feet and be able to defend their own freedom and become the country of South Vietnam. The NVA countered with 36,000 troops. They had quite a few troops, and they were able to bring them in from sanctuaries all over Cambodia and Laos. The American goal was to go up Highway 9 to a place called Chapone, and this is where they would interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Just to the north, our base was Khe Sanh. We had abandoned Khe Sanh after some of the Tet Offensive hostilities that were there and the role of Khe Sanh and the Tet Offensive as a ruse. Now we resupplied it, and this became kind of an American base, Khe Sanh. The column that moved up Route 9 was stopped. It took heavy fire, and again, this is all under ARVN with American air support. So the plan was to go behind that and set up some landing zones, and they set up 3 landing zones, and it was called Lolo, Liz, and Sophia. And these landing zones were more in the jungle, but closer to the Chapone, which was their focus. This is where the problem came in for the United States troops. We had to bring in helicopters to supply and to bring the troops in to these LZs in an attempt to hit Chapone from another angle. And when the helicopters went in, they began to take quite a bit of fire. They, obviously fired back, but there were a number of helicopters that were downed. And the rule was you immediately went down to rescue the crew. When they went down to rescue the crew, they took more heavy fire. So there was a lot of circling over the area, but ships were going down. The North Vietnamese were very quick to pounce on these downed ships, and in many cases capture the crew, or in some cases to execute the crew on the spot. We found that this was an extremely difficult operation, And it was a piecemeal operation. There were different units brought in for this air assault and this air resupply. And units had different strategies, and this is very simple. They would swoop in to a target, and maybe this unit, they were trained that once they swooped in, they turned right. Okay, they turned right to get out of there. So the whole cavalry force of the helicopters would come in and swoop right. Well, then there might be another unit that would come in and they would swoop left, because that was their designation. That was literally not on the same page. I've talked to helicopter pilots who were involved in Lam Son, and they said this is what made it so treacherous in so many ways. There were helicopter crashes in midair, and it was, in a lot of ways, a fiasco. Bad weather eventually came in after 2 months. The Lam Son came to an end with the defeat of the ARVN. The ARVN were trying to get out of there on American helicopters, clinging to the landing pieces and doing everything to get out of there. The United States, we took 168 helicopters were lost. Now this is a number, but sometimes the numbers are very, very changing. You go to different sources and find different numbers. It was very hard to calculate. But we have 168 lost, 618 damaged, 55 crewmen were killed, 178 wounded, and 34 MIA. And you can imagine, either they became prisoners or they were executed on the spot. What Lam Son really revealed was that the process of Vietnamization, they weren't ready for it. They were not ready. There was even a problem with communication from the air to the ground because they didn't really provide for interpreters. And therefore, the men on the ground, the ARVN, spoke mostly Vietnamese. So this became a communication problem as well. So Lam Son 719 was fraught with many difficulties and really turned into a battle which revealed so many of the inadequacies in the Vietnamization process. General Creighton Abrams was taken to task by President Richard Nixon because he felt that Creighton Abrams had built up too much, had been too positive about the Vietnamization process, because he was the man on the ground, and Nixon wanted to know, well, how is this going? Is there coordination and everything else? Eventually, Creighton Abrams is going to be removed for Wayland. That is Lam Son, and it sits out there very prominently in 1971 and was not a good foreboding of the future of Vietnamization. In March of 1970, the United States Senate approves the constitutional amendment which allows the 18-year-old the right to vote. This was a direct outgrowth of Vietnam because it was pretty much clear that Vietnamese our vets were coming back and saying, we can't even vote for the people who send us off to war. So this became a manifestation of the Vietnam War, the amendment. On March 29th of 71, Lieutenant Calley is convicted of murder at My Lai, and he spends a few days in the stockade. And then by April, the organization known as the Vietnam Vets Against the War, the VVAW, began to hold demonstrations in Washington. And a very prominent member of the VVAW was John Kerry, who was a Secretary of State and had run for the presidency. So John Kerry was a key member of the VVAW. June of 1971, something very significant happened. A Pentagon spokesperson, advisor, and worker in the Pentagon, his name was Daniel Ellsberg. And on June the 13th, the New York Times begins to publish the Pentagon Papers. I'm going to play you a short tape, and really it's almost like a trailer for a film about Daniel Ellsberg, who was referred to as the most dangerous man in America by Henry Kissinger. Now, if you listen carefully, you'll hear what Ellsberg wanted to do in the idea of the Pentagon Papers.
That shocking tape about the Pentagon Papers and all the thoughts in Washington surrounding it will be played first thing in the next episode, so don't miss it. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1726 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more, especially to hear the Pentagon Papers tape that you do not want to miss. Thanks again for listening. Come back soon to the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?